So I have a question for you. Have you heard the hype around progressive web apps? Well, if you haven't, don't worry, because the press is all over it, the tech press in particular, and so you won't be able to avoid it for long. They're writing articles like this about how Google and others are plotting the revenge of the web app, which I guess because I'm here to talk about progressive web apps means that I'm part of some sort of secret cabal that's plotting revenge. So watch out, everybody. Or, for example, how progressive web apps promise to upend native applications. We're not going to need native applications anymore. We're just going to build things with the web. That's all we need. Do you remember a couple years ago how Wired wrote that the web was dead? Well, they've got a follow-up article about, hey, the web isn't dead after all, and Google made sure of it. So thank you, Google. But they wrote it, and they saved it because of progressive web apps. And this stuff, like the tech press is going to do this. They're going to take any opportunity they can because they love this idea. They love any opportunity really for a fight, right? To have some sort of disagreement and battle between native and web. And progressive web apps allows them to continue that storyline that they've been going with since 2007. And frankly, it's just driving me a little crazy. It's driving me crazy because there's so many interesting things about progressive web apps. And yet all that we're hearing about is how they compare to native applications. And it's incredibly frustrating in that way. So I'm just going to take a deep breath here and realize that we're really early in the Gartner hype cycle. We're probably about there when it comes to progressive web apps. We have a lot of time to go before people widely know what progressive web apps are, know what they can do, and can see sort of the potential in them. But to the degree to which we continue to look at progressive web apps and sort of think of them in comparison to native applications, it means that the trough of disillusionment will be much deeper, much wider than it needs to be. So I'm here to spend a little bit of time sort of breaking through those myths, talk about what progressive web apps are actually good for, and to talk about why I think you should be looking at building one for your organization now. So first, just briefly, what is a progressive web app? So progressive web apps is a phrase coined by Frances Berryman and her husband Alex Russell to describe a series of technology that used to only be available for native applications. They list a series of things, but Google then took it and sort of condensed it down to 6. I like to really think about 4. I think that there are 4 that actually are the key. The first is nearly instantaneous load times, things that are incredibly fast. Second is the ability to have access to applications, web applications offline. The third is push notifications, using push notifications to bring people back into your application. And the fourth is the ability to install it, to install things onto the home screen of applications. Now, probably the most famous example thus far of a progressive web app is Flipkart. Flipkart is an e-commerce company in India. They built a progressive web app that has been tremendously successful, especially given previously they had given up on the web entirely because they were unsatisfied with the performance on mobile web. But they've built an application that is incredibly fluid. It feels like what you would expect of an application on an Android platform. They're using material design, so all the animations and aesthetics are the aesthetics that people are familiar with. And they can go in and they can turn off Wi-Fi and continue to access the site, continue to interact with that application, or the pieces of the application that have previously been cached. The thing about progressive web apps is they actually represent web best practices. They represent the ways in which we should be building things. And because of that, browsers are providing incentives for progressive web apps. They want to encourage people to adopt this technology. Now, the incentives at the moment are actually pretty simple. For example, the ability to add to home screen. Browsers will now look and recognize that a progressive web app is present, and if somebody visits that progressive web app 2 times, they will put an interstitial up or a banner up to ask if somebody wants to install that application. That heuristic, those 2 visits, is something that they're going to change as they learn more about what people actually respond to, when people actually do add things to their home screen. And they hope to be able to use this as a way to incentivize people to build applications that are faster and better for their users. The second thing to know is that these install banners are things that they can control in some fashion. So as they learn more about what people will actually respond to, they'll change those heuristics. There are a bunch of other things that I think are coming soon, but that we don't know exactly what shape they will take. So for example, app stores. Microsoft has talked about how they're looking at progressive web apps and trying to figure out how they're going to bring them into the Microsoft Store. Chrome earlier this year decided to stop the Chrome App Store, presumably in favor of actually replacing it with something for progressive web apps. So it's not entirely certain how that will work out, but it seems clear that they're going to provide incentives around app stores as a way to distribute your progressive web app. The other piece that I think is probably more interesting is how search engine rankings will change as progressive web apps become more common. Alex Russell has written a bit about how it's pretty easy to imagine Bing and the big engineers deciding to highlight progressive web apps in their search results, to sort of add on to search results things that say, save to home screen immediately instead of having to click through. There are a bunch of different options that search engines could do. Now, Alex adds as a caveat that he doesn't work for Microsoft. He doesn't know what Bing might do. These are just idle speculations on what Bing might be thinking about doing. But Alex does work for Google, which owns a big search engine. So I think it's indicative of the sorts of things that Google is thinking about doing. So it's very likely that we might see something very similar to the AMP carousel, but for progressive web apps. And see that progressive web apps rank higher in search at some point in the future. But even if that isn't the case, even if the browsers didn't have incentives, I would argue that progressive web apps simply make sense, irrespective of browser incentives, irrespective of what you want to do with native applications. And I want to provide you with 6 arguments that I think everybody can agree with, even somebody who might make their career out of building native applications. So the first is that not every customer or potential customer is going to have your app installed. And you may be thinking, well, of course that's the case, right? Duh. Like, we know that that's true. But sometimes we have to restate the obvious things. I've had conversations with business owners about progressive web apps, and they've said, why would I want to do this when we already have a native application? And I have to make the point that 50% or more of their users are not using their native application. And even the people who have the native application installed are sometimes on devices that don't have access to the native application. Maybe they're on their desktop computer at the point at which they want to interact with that application. So building a better web experience for people who do not have the native application either installed or don't have it there makes a lot of sense. And it makes a lot of sense for any potential customers who don't have the application installed. It's probably 100% of potential customers that don't have your app installed. Plus, there are cracks in what's going on in native applications as far as app stores are concerned. There are over 2 million apps inside the iOS and Android app store, so actually standing out inside those app stores is really difficult. We know that, at least in the United States, that actual downloads of applications have decreased. So 49%, ComScore found that 49% of US smartphone owners download 0 applications in the average month. Another approximate 25% of people only download 1 or 2 applications per month. So your ability to be successful with a native application is difficult. And once you get them installed, loyalty rates are low. So the average Android application, after 3 days, over 70% of daily active users no longer use the application. By the end of 90 days, that has gone down to something like 90% of people have abandoned the application. So being in the App Store isn't sufficient. Right now, we're doing a lot of social and advertising in order to get people into native applications, and those activities oftentimes lead people to the web. Mobile web audiences are 3 times as large and growing twice as fast as the App Store. Now, I've spent a lot of time sort of talking about the App Store, and I don't think that this means that native applications go away. I just want to say fundamentally that for pretty much every business, that they have an incentive to provide a better experience for web users, because those are either people who eventually will download their application, and so you need to sort of have a good experience for that first interaction, or There are people who may never download that application, but if you could provide them with a better experience, you would garner more revenue from them. The second reason that you should do something is that you should probably provide a secure site or application for your customers, right? Because of, hackers or, those three-letter agencies that like to peek at stuff. This, again, seems like a no-brainer, and it's gotten much easier than it's been in the past, with things like Let's Encrypt allowing us to freely and quickly access certificates. Browser makers are making it so that a lot of the features that we want to use, a lot of upcoming features, only work under HTTPS. So even things like geolocation, which used to be available under HTTP, are no longer available just under HTTP. You have to be under HTTPS to access them. Plus, when you start using things like HTTPS, you get access to the features of progressive web apps, and you're able to do things like take advantage of HTTP2 and be able to provide a more performant experience for your users. And speaking of performance, the third argument is that you should provide a fast experience for your web customers. I don't need to convince you of that here, but what I will say is that progressive web apps are one of the best ways to do this. Right? What happens with progressive web apps is that we use service workers to cache things offline. We get complete control over what the browser caches. And what we found is that by doing this, we're able to make sure that those assets that are needed to sort of boot up a web page very quickly, boot up an application very quickly, are always present. Google, when they did a progressive web app for Google I/O, found that the median load time, median time to first paint, actually, I think it was, is 580 milliseconds. Incredibly, incredibly fast, like instantaneous to human perception. And it was all done because they were using service workers and being able to use a progressive web app. They also found that people used their progressive web app more than they used the native application, despite the fact that that was at a conference full of people who work on Android devices. All right, the fourth thing we should do is we should make sure that web customers, or we can probably assume that web customers would benefit from an offline experience. And the great thing about this is that all of the work that's done with service workers to make pages fast is the same work that needs to be done to support offline behavior. Right? If you're already working on making sure that you understand what assets are going to get cached, then looking at your application and trying to figure out what things might somebody want to have access to offline is something that makes sense and something that you should do. The fifth item is that your customers might benefit from push notifications. Now, push notifications have been proven to increase user engagement. They are another piece of progressive web apps. They're an optional piece. They don't make sense in every single situation, but they are there as something that you can optionally add. And if you're a company like eBay, for example, where there's a loyal set of people who have the application installed, but there's a whole bunch of people who just follow links. Maybe a friend shares an auction item and they go and they look at it. Wouldn't it be great if eBay could ask them, hey, do you want to receive a push notification 5 minutes before this auction ends? That person doesn't have to make the commitment to have an app and have that sort of full relationship with a user. They can just, or with eBay, they can just make the decision to receive notifications. And that's one of the really great things about progressive web apps is that every feature of it is available the first time somebody hits a site. They don't actually need to go to the point of installing the application to have access to these features. And the sixth thing is you can create a text file, right, with some icons in it. Because once you've done the other 5, that's all that's left. And as a matter of fact, that text file, that manifest file, is something that you should have anyways. It's actually what's used by Android to figure out what icons would show up when somebody manually saves the web page to their home screen. So you should have a manifest file anyways. And manifest files are simple JSON documents. So here's why I think it makes sense to work on a progressive web app, is that every step along the way to a progressive web app makes sense on its own, right? Every step is something that makes the experience better for your customers. And what's really great about this is that as you work on a progressive web app, that actual process, your roadmap, can be sort of incremental. So when we started working on a progressive web app, we started in July when we launched our new site. And when we launched our new site, we decided to move to HTTPS because we knew that where we wanted to be ultimately was to have a progressive web app. That was the first step. Like immediately, our users got the benefit of having a secure environment, and they also got the benefit of HTTP2, so they got a faster experience. Then a couple months later, we started working with service workers, and we decided to use service workers to cache common assets. And once we had that and shipped it, our users benefited from that. At that point, we hadn't figured out how we were going to handle offline, but we had that piece. Then we tackled offline, tested that, shipped it, and they benefited from having offline. Now we're doing the same thing with push notifications. So each part of the process is something that you can actually ship and users get benefit from. You don't have to do it all as one holistic bundle, which I think is a really great thing. And each step makes sense. Each step is providing that better experience. The early returns on progressive web apps are really promising. So, for example, Konga, which is an e-commerce company in Nigeria, has found that by doing a progressive web app, they get 92% less data for the initial load versus what they were previously doing with the native application. It takes 82% less data to complete the first transaction versus their native application. And in Africa, where a lot of people are on metered connections, these sorts of performance boons make a big difference. Etc. Electronics has seen a 12% increase in click-through rate, 100% more sales from users arriving via web push, and a 4 times increase in user engagement. 5 Miles has seen a 50% decrease in bounce rate, a 30% increase in time spent on site, and 30% better conversion for users who arrive via add to home screen. And there's a whole series of case studies on Google's site where you can see companies talking about the benefits that they're seeing, the sort of like real revenue and user engagement numbers that are coming because of the move to progressive web apps. Now, there's a common rebuttal whenever I talk about progressive web apps, which is that iOS doesn't support progressive web apps. And it's really frustrating. What'll happen is you'll get people really excited about this. And in particular, I think people get excited about the idea that they've got an icon on the home screen. For some reason, that's like the thing that like CEOs and like senior leadership really latch onto. And then when they find out that they can't get that sort of behavior on iOS, they decide, well, there's no reason to do it now. And it is insanely frustrating because here's the thing, right? Progressive web apps work fine on iOS. They don't have all the features, but they're progressive. It uses progressive enhancement, which means that people are able to continue to use those applications on iOS without any issue. And there are billions of people using browsers that support progressive web app features. So Chrome and Opera support the full set of progressive web app features. Firefox supports, I think, everything but the app install banner. Microsoft is committed to supporting progressive web apps fully. Hey, even Safari, even Apple, has talked about how, or has hinted at how they're probably going to be supporting service workers in the future. Now, we don't know for certain, but, like, that's about as good of an indication we get from Apple about anything, is these sorts of hints. So it seems really clear that we have billions of people who would benefit from doing this sort of stuff. And because that's progressive enhancement, we don't prevent anyone from accessing a progressive web app. We should do this. Plus, the early examples of progressive web apps show an increase in usage and benefits on iOS, even though iOS doesn't support a progressive web app. So AliExpress has a 104% increase in conversion of new users across all browsers. They're seeing an 82% increase in iOS conversion. The Washington Post said that they're seeing a 5x increase in user engagement. And I asked their product manager if there was any difference between what they were seeing in user engagement on Android versus iOS. And he said that there was minimal difference between the two of them. So why is this? And I have a theory that it's performance related, that progressive web apps are faster even on iOS, even though they don't support all of the features of service workers. Now, I end up having sort of a disagreement with some of my friends about this, who argue that it is disingenuous or misleading to argue that progressive web apps are responsible for the increase in user engagement for the Washington Post, because or for AliExpress because of the fact that they don't support service workers, because they don't support push notifications and these sorts of things. And I get that argument. But if it weren't for progressive web apps, right? Basically, the argument, just in brief, is that these companies probably had a site that sucked beforehand. And so like what they've done is they've made a better website, and thus, like by making a better website, they're increasing conversion. So yay, but it has nothing to do with a progressive web app. And I definitely get that argument. But here's the thing, like part of convincing organizations to invest in things is actually having a reason for them to do it. So progressive web apps provide organizations with a reason to reinvest in the web, a reason for them to look at re-architecting their web pages and making them performant, because it's a requirement of a progressive web app. And so these sites, whether it's the Washington Post or whether it's AliExpress, right, the process of making a progressive web app forced them to look at their site in a different way, forced them to re-engineer it in a different way that made it more performant. And it is better on sites or in browsers that support progressive web apps fully, but it's also better in iOS. And this is one of the reasons why I think that all of us in this room should be really excited about this, because progressive web apps could potentially be like a Trojan horse for performance, right? Like you get people excited about the icon on the home screen, and then you tell them, well, Lighthouse, the thing that meters whether or not you're a progressive web app or not, the thing that decides the sort of metrics that decide whether or not the app install banner shows up, is looking at performance. So we're going to have to make the site faster. I'm sorry, CEO. Like, that's just the way it's going to have to be. So progressive web apps, even if they can't be attributed directly to providing every one of those benefits on iOS, I believe that they are key to organizations deciding to reinvest in the web. So I started by talking about the hype around progressive web apps and how it's incredibly annoying, particularly this hype related to natives versus web. And I wanted to tamper down that hype. And then I spent like 20 minutes like hyping you back up about progressive web apps. And that's because I feel like the hype is like just wrongly focused. And so over here, when it's talking about native versus web, it's just like, it's insane and it's frustrating and it's the wrong thing to be focusing on. But when it comes to actually talking about what progressive web apps could represent for the web and for the people who access our services via the web, I actually think the hype isn't big enough yet. I think that the combination of the features in progressive web apps and some of the other things that are going on in our industry, like web components and the payment request API and Apple Pay on web, like these things have the potential for us to finally provide incredibly fast, frictionless experiences on mobile devices, the things that we've been striving for since mobile, sort of the mobile boom took off. And they're now within our grasp. We just need to work on building them. So tomorrow, I encourage you to go watch Andy Davies. He's giving a talk that provides much more detail about how to actually build progressive web apps. And I encourage you to go back to your organizations and start working on a progressive web app now. Thank you very much.